All right, let's just jump right in. We all need fresh water, obviously, but to manage it well, we need to know how much is actually in our rivers. Now, that sounds simple, right? But it's a massive challenge because you just can't stick a measuring device in every single stream and river on the planet. So, how do you even begin to fill in those gaps? Well, this explainer is going to break down a really fascinating study that tried to do exactly that. So, you gotta ask, right? How much water is really in our rivers? It's a fundamental question. Is there enough for our towns, for our crops, for, well, nature itself? And here's the shocking part. For the vast majority of the world's waterways, we honestly have no idea. We're essentially flying blind. There's actually a name for this. Hydrologists call it the ungauged basin problem. A basin is basically just a big patch of land where all the rain and streams drain into one river. And if that river doesn't have a gauge, some measuring gear, it's a complete mystery. It's like this giant black hole in our data, and it's one of the single biggest headaches for anyone trying to manage water. So to try and tackle this, a group of researchers zeroed in on this specific spot in southern Thailand. Now, they had a really good starting point. They had solid data from 65 runoff stations. You can see them here. They're those little triangles scattered on the map. The big idea? Use what they knew from those 65 spots to figure out the water flow for the entire region, to fill in all those unmeasured blanks. Okay, so before they could even think about predicting the unknown, they had to do something really important with the data they did have. They basically needed to split the river's total flow into its different parts. It's kind of like taking apart a cake to see how much flour, sugar, and eggs went into it. You have to understand the ingredients first. And the most important ingredient, the real key here, is something called baseflow. Now, this isn't the flashy water from a big storm that just gushes through. No. Baseflow is that slow, steady trickle that comes from groundwater seeping into the river. You can think of it as the river's pulse, its heartbeat. It's what keeps the river alive during the dry times, which makes it absolutely critical when you're talking about droughts. So the question becomes, how in the world do you separate that steady baseflow from the chaotic rush of a storm? Well, the researchers put two different methods to the test. First, there's the local minimum method. It's a pretty straightforward graphical trick. You just connect the dots between the lowest flow points over time. Then there's the Eckhart filter, which is a bit more high-tech. It's a digital filter that's designed to separate that high-frequency, spiky signal of a storm from the low-frequency, smooth signal of the baseflow. And right here, you can see how that contest played out. This graph plots something called the Baseflow Index, which is just a fancy way of saying what percentage of the river's water is baseflow. And what do you see? That red line, which is the local minimum method, is consistently higher than the blue line from the Eckhart filter, almost every single time. And that lines up perfectly with what the researchers themselves concluded. They found that the local minimum method seemed to be overestimating the baseflow. And it makes sense, right? Just drawing straight lines between the low points is a bit cruder than the more detailed day-by-day filtering the Eckhart method does. All right, so now they had a solid method for figuring out baseflow at their 65 known locations. And that meant they were finally ready for the main event, taking that knowledge and using it to predict the flow everywhere else, in all those places with zero data. The name for this is spatial interpolation. And the weather station analogy is perfect. You might not have a thermometer in your yard, but you can get a pretty darn good idea of the temperature by looking at the official weather stations around your town, right? Spatial interpolation is exactly that, but instead of temperature, we're talking about water. And the process itself is pretty logical. Step 1, you grab all your known data, so the baseflow from those 65 stations. Step 2, you use some math to make an educated guess about all the blank spots in between. And step 3, you put it all together and voila, you've got a continuous map covering the entire region. But which mathematical rule do you use? That's the million-dollar question. So, the researchers held another little contest, a kind of scientific showdown between three popular techniques: inverse distance weighting, which we'll call IDW, Kriging, and Spline. Each one has its own unique way of filling in the gaps. So, after all that work, separating the baseflow, then testing the different mapping methods, who was the winner? Well, it turns out the results were incredibly clear-cut. I mean, this scorecard pretty much tells the whole story. The researchers looked at a couple of key things. For accuracy, they checked the correlation, higher is better. For mistakes, they looked at the error rate, and for that, lower is better. And as you can see, one of these methods just knocks it out of the park. And the winner is inverse distance weighting, or IDW. It's actually a really intuitive idea. It basically says that a known point that's closer to your unknown spot should have more say in the guess than a point that's farther away. Makes sense, right? Super simple, but in this case, it was crazy effective. And we're not talking about a photo finish here. IDW was the clear winner, hands down. It didn't matter if they were looking at the dry season or the soaking wet monsoon season, IDW gave them the most accurate results with the fewest errors every single time. Okay, and this is the big payoff. This is where it all comes together. By combining the best tool for the job at each step, so the Eckhart filter to find the base flow and IDW to map it out, the researchers could finally create what they'd been working towards. And here they are. These are the final annual maps for the whole region. So the map on the left, that's the total volume of baseflow. We're talking millions of cubic meters of water. The one on the right is that Baseflow Index again. It shows you what percentage of the river is that stable groundwater flow. In both cases, the rule is simple. Darker blue means more water and a more stable river. But let's break it down by season, because that's where it gets really interesting. Look at this map from March, right in the middle of the dry season. See how much lighter the colors are? Across most of the area, you're seeing less than 20 million cubic meters. This is when that base flow, that steady pulse from the groundwater, is literally the only thing keeping some of these rivers from going completely dry. Now hold on and look at this. This is November, the peak of the monsoon. The difference is just incredible, right? The whole map is lit up with dark blue. The groundwater is totally topped up, and some of these rivers are getting over 100 million cubic meters from base flow alone. It just shows that the model they built really nailed this huge seasonal change. So you might be thinking, why does all this matter? Well, it matters a ton, because maps like these are incredibly powerful. For the first time, water managers can actually see, month by month, which places have enough water and which ones are in trouble. This helps them plan how to share water between cities and farms, how to get through a drought, and even how to make sure there's enough left for the fish and the rest of the ecosystem. It's all about making smarter choices, because you finally have the right information. And that really brings us to the big picture takeaway. In a way, what this research has created is a kind of digital twin for an entire river system. And as we look to the future, as our climate changes and rainfall gets weirder and more unpredictable, that leads to a really important question. Can this kind of model help us prepare for that more uncertain future?